This is our first organ system that we're going to be going over, and it is about skin, hair, nails. My pet term for the integumentary system is the money pit. It's where we love to spend our money. Skin, tattoos, tanning salons, airbrushing, or what is it, spray tanning, hair, nails. So much money spent on preventing acne, sebaceous glands, mammary glands. So all of those are part of the integumentary system. So let's start off with an introduction, which is skin and hair and nails is really the most visible part of our body, visible organ system. And it's meant to attract people we want to attract, but it also, believe it or not, is there to protect us from the environment and UV rays and keep us warm. Skin also is a window into the health of someone. Clinicians a lot of times can look to see if your liver is not working properly. You can get what is called jaundice, or have a yellow tone to your skin. Malnourished people, their hair and nails would look weak and thin. People that have, smoke a lot of toxins, and that dries out the skin. You get more wrinkles, sun exposure, of course. So it is kind of, it enables people to kind of see the health of someone based on what their skin, hair, and nails looks like. But it also includes other things like sweat glands and sebaceous glands and mammillary glands. The skin is also referred to as your cutaneous membrane, right? And I talked about in chapter 3, the definition of a membrane means it's one part epithelial and one part connective tissue. I should say epithelial tissue. How about that? Epithelial tissue. So that's what a membrane is. And this is your cutaneous membrane, which is your skin. And so the superficial epithelium is called the epidermis. So epidermis is epithelium, and the dermis portion is connective tissue. And so the two combined make up a membrane. That makes sense because, as you probably have heard your skin referred to as your cutaneous membrane, maybe not, but the underlying layer below your cutaneous membrane is referred to as subcutaneous layer. So your subcutaneous layer is the layer below the cutaneous membrane. So let's see, arrows are pretty bad here. Well, let's try that again, because that's just a sad arrow. So below cutaneous membrane. Also, you hear the terms epidermis. Remember, epi means on top or around. So it's on top or around the dermis. And the layer below the dermis is called the hypodermis, right? Hypo is below. So below the dermis, or subcutaneous is below the cutaneous membrane. They're the same thing. There are all 4 types of tissues found in the integumentary system, and it covers a lot of square footage. So surface area is SA, SF is square footage. Skin not only protects us, but it also helps us thermoregulate, or regulate our body temperature, and it also helps us excrete or get rid of things when necessary. A couple other functions, we synthesize vitamin D in our skin, and we can store extra energy in the form of adipocytes or fat cells. in the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. The functional organization, these diagrams are super good to go through and reading them because it kind of summarizes the functional organization of the integumentary system. Here are the functions, and there's a list. Physical protection from the environment, synthesis and storage of lipid reserves, right? Subcutaneous hypodermis. Control of immune response and cancer to skin. It's constantly being regenerated, the epidermises. And there are also a lot of phagocytotic white blood cells that if you do break the epidermis, that they will take care of these pathogens before it gets into the underlying connective tissue where your blood supply is. Sensory information, our skin has a lot of sensory receptors, so we can monitor what's touching us, how hot it is, how hard that touches, if it's actually going through the epidermis into the dermis. We have free nerve endings that let us know that's not a good thing, and we call that pain. Also regulating our body temperature and getting rid of excess ions through our sweat. Also sebaceous glands produce oils that lubricate the epidermis and keep it waterproofed. And then protection. So cutaneous membrane, remember, a membrane is part epithelial and part connective tissue, right? So the epidermis and the dermis. And so the epidermis has kind of a slightly different function list than the dermis. So epidermis protects the dermis, controls permeability and prevents water loss. It is kind of waterproofed. If your epidermis wasn't waterproofed, the minute you jumped into a swimming pool or some kind of water, that water is going to move into your body because you're going to have more sodium, potassium, and a higher concentration inside your little body unit than would be inside a huge body of water. And so osmosis would occur and you would blow up. That doesn't happen because the epidermis kind of controls permeability of water coming in or leaving your body. You have these phagocytic cells that are going to try to kill off any pathogens that might end up on your skin. Also, it's very dry comparatively, and so bacteria can't really grow very well there. Your epidermis is where we synthesize vitamin D3. There are sensory receptors for touch, pressure, pain, and thermoregulation or temperature, and can also kind of coordinate immune response to pathogens and also skin cancers. The dermis, the upper layer is called the papillary layer. So you can see I'm outlining it here, how this right here is all epidermis. And then this portion all in here is connective tissue. And the connective tissue and the epidermis have these fingers that go up and down, and fingers, when something's shaped kind of like fingers, we call it papilla. And so this area right here is the papillary region, papillary layer. And this is where there's blood supply from the dermis can go up and service the epidermis. Below this papillary region is the reticular region, and this really is where there's more robust immune response. In the hypodermal regions, you store lipids kind of down low, attaches the cutaneous membrane to the underlying tissues, and you have more sensory receptors for more sensation. And here's also where there is actual blood supply. And when you're exercising, you're really hot, you have excess heat inside your body, and it travels in your blood to your reticular layer, and then it diffuses that heat out through your sweat. So you have sweat glands in the reticular layers of your dermis, and it produces this watery substance called sweat, and it releases the heat up with that water to your epidermis, and when it evaporates off your epidermis, that's when you actually cool down. That's why it's hot, humid. It's really hard to feel cooled down because your sweat sits on your epidermis and never evaporates, so you always feel hot. You have to have that sweat evaporate to feel like you're cooling down. Okay, so accessory structures, hair, exocrine glands. Remember, exo means outside, so these are glands that are secreting things that are going to leave your body. And that would be sweat glands, sebaceous glands, mammillary glands, and then nails are last. Okay, so let's talk about the cutaneous membrane. Again, this portion right here is the epidermis. And remember, there is the papillary region, which goes up and down. So from here to here, it's epidermis. And then from here down, I should say, kind of ends relatively quickly. Let's make it a little different. So from here to about here is the papillary. And the papillary have these finger-like extensions. And you notice here is where the capillaries that come all the way up to the epidermis are going to be located, right? So this is all epidermis. So this whole layer here. And epidermis, remember, epithelial cells are avascular. So does not have blood flow, no blood flow. And so because of that, it relies on the little capillaries in the papillary region to bring nutrients so they can diffuse up, right? So there's diffusion of O2 and nutrients from the papillary region of the dermis. And so I don't know if you've noticed, but if you fall on asphalt and you kind of skin your knee or skin your palm along the asphalt and you just kind of shave off a layer or two of your epidermis, you only bleed in little dots. Like you'll see little dots. I should make it red. So you have a little dots of blood like that. That is because if you are if you end up, and I'll erase this, if you end up shaving off some of your epidermis, you're only going to have blood showing here, right? You might have blood showing here, and you may have blood showing. It's not going to be uniform across because the papillary region, these blood vessels come up into the epidermis and then the epidermis goes deeper next to it. And so you end up looking like you just have little dots of blood because of this papillary layer. So that's kind of important to have a visual on. And then everything from kind of below this on down is going to be the reticular layer. And so the reticular layer is where you have the glands, like sweat glands. And you're going to have a hair root or two. You're going to have sebaceous glands attached to the hair root. I should say hair shaft. All right. Yeah. Root. Oops. And there's some other structures. There's some sensory stuff in here. There's a Lamolina corpuscles. There's free nerve endings throughout, free nerve endings around the hair roots and so forth. And then the little muscles called erector pili muscles. They're attached to hair roots as well. So you got other stuff going on. And then finally, with the last layer is the subcutaneous, so below the cutaneous membrane, or hypodermis, below the dermis. And this is just dominated by adipocytes also known as fat cells. And you also have something called the cutaneous plexus. This right here is the cutaneous, right? Because it services the cutaneous membrane, and it's a network of blood vessels. So arteries and veins. And so in this hypodermal region, you have major blood supply to the cutaneous membrane. And so some of you guys may have heard the term hypodermic needle. That's a needle that shoots or injects the substance into the hypodermal region because that is where the bigger blood vessels are to get that substance into the bloodstream. And so that is how it got the name hypodermic needle. All right, so integumentary. This is the diagram you will be expected to label. So you need to understand the epidermal region and the dermal region, and you need to know the difference between the papillary and the reticular layer. And then finally the subcutaneous layer, or hypodermis, also has another name, which is superficial fascia. So superficial fascia is the hypodermal or subcutaneous region. Now, on this side, hair shaft, pore of a sweat gland, tactile corpuscle, that is for touch receptor. So that is a receptor. Sebaceous glands, these are glands that produce sebaceous oils. And this kind of waterproofs your skin and gives it a less dried out, wrinkly kind of look to it. This is also where acne comes. So acne is a result of sebaceous glands producing oils, and those oils go up to the top and they spread out, right? And they keep you waterproofed. But what happens is if that pore is blocked with dirt, or you produce too much sebaceous oil, or too much oil, these glands get blocked, right? And so you have a bunch of oil getting backed up in here, and it shows up as acne, right? So you have kind of pus growing because the sebaceous oil is not allowed to get out to the surface and disperse, and it backs up, and anything fluid that's kind of sitting in one place for too long has the tendency to grow bacteria, and so that's why it gets white and pussy and not very attractive. Acne medications are trying to dry out and kind of slough off these top layers to open up that pore. Some of the real hardcore acne medications will kind of dry up the sebaceous gland producing oils. And so some people on Accutane or these kind of hardcore acne drugs, they look really dried out, their lips get dried out and so forth because the sebaceous glands the medication is aiming at decreasing the secretions. The erector pili muscles, these are attached to your hair roots, and so they're what give you like goosebumps. You see we have so many hairs. You have a lot more hairs than you can actually see on your dermis and epidermis, and but each one of those hairs has an erector pili muscle, and they contract when you're cold. So you get goosebumps when you're cold or when you're scared, right? So think about a cat or a dog. When they get really scared, their hair stands up, kind of fluffs up so they look bigger. When you're scared or cold, your hair fluffs up. You can't see the hair, but you can see the little bumps that occur because those erector pili muscles are contracting. Then you have sweat glands. These are these hose-like structures here. And they look like hoses. I don't like that color, to be honest with you. They look like hoses that have not been rolled up. Okay, so I'm going to do water. So this would be a sweat gland. And then you have the sweat gland duct, and then you have the pore of the sweat gland. Hair follicle. It kind of shows you here the hair follicle. And these hair follicles grow on a 2 to 5 year cycle. And so the hair follicle will grow a hair for 2 to 5 years. The kind of root will shrivel up and a new one will grow in its place. But as you age, that regrowth process slows down, and so that's why people tend to have less hair as they get older. Lamolina Corpuscle is another touch receptor, pressure receptor, a little bit deeper in the dermis. Tactile corpuscles are up in the epidermal papillary region. And last, you have free nerve endings. These are for pain, and they're attached to your hair roots, so we can feel when our hair is being touched or pulled. And then important, you need to know the cutaneous plexus. So this is in the hypodermal or subcutaneous region, and that is your major artery and vein for the integumentary system, are located there in the hypodermis. One thing that I want to highlight is that the epidermis, so we're talking about the epidermis here. This is all epidermis. It's all stratified squamous to some extent. But it looks different, right? So this area here, from here to here, looks very different than from, say, here to here. And you would say, why? Why do they look different? They're all stratified squamous. They start out stratified squamous. Well, the difference is going to be in the fact that here's where the blood supply is. These cells from here to here are getting nutrients because diffusion only works in small distances. I should say short distance. And so by the time, so as new cells are getting created, so these are brand new cells, so these are the new cells, and as each new cell gets created, older cells get pushed up, right? So new cells come, older cells get pushed up. And when they get pushed up too far away from the papillary region where the blood supply is, they're just too far away for diffusion to work. And so by the time they get up to this layer, no diffusion is occurring. And so these cells start to die. And so they really are dead by the time they get up here, right? So these are dead cells. And that is why you can, people will say, oh, you can loofah or scrub or microdermabrate off the top layers of your skin because they're dead cells. And as people age and they get wrinkled, these dead cells that, or even for acne, these dead cells will clog your pores and create kind of a thicker epidermis, which then shows wrinkles in more depth. So microdermabrasion, Retin-A, both those things will scrub off these dead cells so you have less acne, and you also have less deep looking wrinkles as you age. And so that's why they, women, men, whoever, get microdermabrasion to kind of get those top layers off. So they look younger. So this figure 4.2, important to know all the structures and be able to label it. As far as the functions, again, we've gone through these: protection of chemicals, excretion of certain things, and this is in more detail and explaining it. Vitamin D synthesis, sensation, touch, pressure, pain, temperature, all through nerve endings or special nerve endings in the skin. A lot of macrophagic cells, white blood cells, looking to kill off pathogens before they get into your blood. Also UV radiation, keeping your water in or moisture in, and then regulation of body temperature. So your skin does it a few different ways. So sweat, right? So one, you sweat and you get rid of heat when sweat evaporates off skin. So that's one way. Two, erector pili muscles, not as effective, but you can fluff. So let's just say, how would we say? Oh, fluff up hair for warmth. I don't know if that really works. Doesn't really work, but kind of. And then the last one that I'm going to highlight is blood flow, right? So blood flow is here, number 3. So when you're really, really cold, your body wants to protect your vital organs, right? Thorax. And so it's going to vasoconstrict vessels to skin because your heat is really carried in your blood, and it's going to make it go to your thorax. So heat to thorax via blood. That is why when it's cold, skin turns what color? Blue, right? So your skin looks blue when you're cold because all of the heat in the blood has been shifted to the internal organs. Your blood flow has decreased to your skin and increased to your vital organs. When you're hot, skin turns what color? Red. Why? Blood with heat goes to skin to be released with sweat, right? So your skin goes red because now your blood flow is being pushed out to your skin so you can get rid of the heat in your sweat, and so you have a red color to it. So your circulatory system really does also help out in warmth and cold, whether it's bringing blood to your skin or not bringing blood to your skin. Okay, so skin and cutaneous membrane. Again, one division is epidermis, 2 is the dermis. And then deep to the cutaneous membrane or the dermal layer is the subcutaneous, or also called hypodermis. And then the accessory structures. Again, hypodermis, subcutaneous layer is another name, and that is superficial fascia. Okay, so papillary region we've kind of gone through. Again, the capillaries for diffusing up to epidermis, dermal cells. There's also nerves. Between the papillary region and the epidermis, you have these dermal papillas. These are these fingers here. The reticular layer is deep. It has more reticular fibers. That's how it gets its name. So more reticular fibers. And this is where you're going to have the glands, the hair follicles, and some more nerve structures. All right, so epidermal cells. Now, your epidermis really starts out all stratified squamous cells. And those stratified squamous cells, as they get pushed up from the bottom layers of the epidermis that are next to the papillary region, they start producing a tough kind of protein called keratin. And so this keratin that's being produced, we just call these stratified squamous cells that are keratinized keratinocytes. Really, they're really stratified squamous cells that have been keratinized. And this is most of your epidermis. There are other cells found in the epidermis, melanocytes. Melanocytes produce pigment or melanin pigment, and that is what this pigment, by the way, is produced and released in response to UV rays. So we call it tanning, right? So when someone gets more tan, those melanocytes have released Melanin in response to UV rays, and so you get darker. Why? Because this darker color kind of cuts down or slows down the UV rays. Think about it. There are stem cells or basal cells that are undergoing mitosis and creating new epidermis all the time. And every time you undergo mitosis, if a UV ray happens to hit a dividing cell in the wrong way, that cell can then divide incorrectly, and we call that skin cancer. So a lot of skin cancers are due to mitosis gone wrong, and then they just keep dividing and they're not producing the same normal cells. So basal cell carcinoma is an example of that. And so melanin, this pigment, makes you darker, and it kind of slows down these UV rays, so it has less chance to affect the dividing cells when they're undergoing mitosis and creating new epidermal cells. The number of melanocytes you are born with determines the color of your skin. So if you have very few melanocytes, you're going to be a white color. If you have more melanocytes, you're going to be a little bit darker, and a lot of melanocytes are super dark. And this is just an adaptation to really where you biologically have come from. So if your ancestors have come from an area where there is a lot of UV exposure, you're near the equator, it was a protective mechanism to have more melanocytes because you need that extra protection, that extra color or melanin darkness. If you're from the polar areas towards the North or South Pole, there's less sun exposure. And so you need less melanocytes because you need all the UV rays you can get to produce vitamin D. And so people near the poles or have ancestors that have come from the North or South tend to be a whiter color. They tend to look lighter. They also sunburn and they don't tan because they have less melanocytes, right? So they're not going to produce melanin. So they just get red and they have a higher risk of skin cancer as a result. So melanocytes really are just a genetic thing that has been determined by where your ancestors have come from for kind of biological reasons, what is going to be advantageous. Langerhans are phagocytotic cells. Again, if you don't remember what phagocytosis means, look it up. It's chapter 2, and you need to know that. And these are immune defender cells. Merkel cells are deep to the epidermal layers, and they are your touch receptors. They release chemicals that give information about things that are touching you, and these chemicals are really neurotransmitters. They're called baroreceptors. When there's pressure, it distorts these nerve endings and lets you know how much pressure is being applied and where it's being applied. Now your skin, most of your skin is 4 layers, distinct layers. But on your palms, hands, soles of feet, there are 5 layers. So 5 layers on, and we call this thick skin. And the rest of it, you don't really call it thin skin, but 4 layers. So the 4 distinct layers, okay, so this is, write this in yellow so you can see it, papillary region of dermis is here. And so this is the papilla. So this is the border, right, between the dermis and the epidermis. And so this bottom region here, which is really just kind of hugging, that's here, it's kind of just hugging the papillary areas, is the stratum germinativum. So this is the first layer. So the stratum germinativum, sometimes called the stratum basal, right? So stratum, S stands for stratum. This is where the basal cells are located. Basal cells are stem cells. These are the ones that are undergoing mitosis and create new cells. Okay, so in the stratum germinativum, you have the basal cells or stem cells. That's where basal cell carcinoma. These are the cells if they divide wrong or have something hit them in a wrong way and they start creating new bad cells or rogue cells. We call that basal cell carcinoma or cancer. They replace more superficial keratinocytes. So those are the ones that are pushed up. This is where the melanocytes are located and the Merkel cells. The next layer up is going to be stratum spinosum, right? So it's this here. So this is stratum spinosum. And stratum spinosum, it's called stratum spinosum because this is where it starts production of keratin fibers. And these keratin fibers look like spines. And so that's where it gets the name spinosum or spines. They produce these protein filaments, keratin that connects one cell to another cell or cross braces them. Melanocytes are also located here, and Langerhans are immune cells. So this keratin gets created. It looks like spines. We call it stratum spinosum, and this is where you start to have this differentiation from just basic squamous cells into keratinocytes because they're keratinized. They start to interlock with one another as they get pushed up to the next layer, which is stratum granulosum. So here is where you got stratum granulosum, and these keratin fibers start to interlock themselves and produce almost like a solid structure instead of just individual cells being attached to one another. So that's stratum granulosum. Now, stratum lucidium is only in thick skin. Right, so this is the extra layer that you have for thick skin. So this is where you get the 5 layers. And so stratum lucidium, lucid means you can kind of see. And so lucidium means glassy, and it's only in thick skin. All right, the last one is going to be stratum corneum. This is that layer of dead cells, right? So these are dead, whoops, did not mean to do that. Dead cells, right? So this is the majority of your epidermis. You got a lot of dead cells, right? Why? Because it's extra barrier to outside. And so this is your protection. You got a lot of layers that can go before you get down here where the blood supply is. And so it protects you from things getting into your bloodstream. So the stratum corneum is your dead, durable, expendable cells. It's relatively dry, and so no microorganisms can grow there, and it's water resistant because it's been so keratinized, and you have the sebaceous oils that don't allow water to cross over as well. So it creates this water resistance. So this just goes through the stratums here, and instead of germinativum, it now calls it stratum basal. They're the same thing. So go through the characteristics, right, and the layers. So this goes through some definitions. Again, everything we've covered here, and so you can read through these things. So that's the epidermis. The dermis, again, is the papillary layer. Here's where the blood supply to epidermis exists. And then the reticular layer where structures are more structural. And again, it's showing you the papillary regions, and then this again is the epidermis. Papillary region, reticular region, and it goes to the dermis. So reticular, you have dense, irregular connective tissue that's holding the structure. This is where you have the hair follicle, sweat glands, sebaceous glands. Dermis. Things to think about. Epidermis is regenerative, meaning you are creating new epidermis all the time. Slows down as you get old, but for now, you're doing good. Dermis, on the other hand, right? Epidermis is regenerative because it's epithelial tissue. That's different. Dermis is connective tissue and is not regenerative. And so what happens is, because it's non-regenerative, if you damage it, it's not going to grow back the same. It's not going to regenerate. And so it has wear and tear, right? So these collagen fibers that are nice and tight and strong when you're young become less nice and tight when you get older. And so the skin starts to stretch and you start having wrinkles, right? So wrinkles are just, you get with age, just from wear and tear, but also different hormone levels and the amount of damage can cause the connective tissue to even be more damaged. If you suffer sunburn after sunburn after sunburn after sunburn and you have damage, it's going to be to your dermal region, because your epidermal region is being regenerative. So you're not going to have wrinkles in your epidermis, you can have wrinkles in your dermis. And it just shows because the epidermis goes with the dermis. So really the dermal area is the area we worry about. If you're getting things that are permanent in your skin, like tattoos, you're also not going to have that tattoo put into the epidermis. Well, a henna tattoo you put in your epidermis, but then eventually those cells all get sloughed off that have the dye in them, and you don't have that tattoo anymore. If you want a permanent tattoo, you got to go all the way down to the dermal region and put the ink in the dermal region, which is fine, except you have to remember, and you have to also be aware that when you're adding a tattoo into your body, you're also adding it into an area where you have blood supply. And so that really does lead you to having infections or having problems, because now you're introducing some kind of ink into an area that can get into your blood. So you always have to think of the consequences of, you know, why people get infections or why you can get diseases when things go all the way down. So here's depressing things to think about: wrinkles, stretch marks, and tension lines. Because it's non-regenerative, they stretch. Over time, they stay stretched. You don't get new collagen fibers, no matter what the package of that really expensive lotion says. When people get injections or fillers, they're basically replacing connective tissue that has withered over time, or they're putting in what would be normally fat cells or fat in that subcutaneous region. They put new molecules in there because as we age, subcutaneous fat tends to decrease and internal fat tends to increase. So fat just kind of moves around. If you have excessive damage to the epidermis and you damage the basal cells, then you're going to have a scar, right? So the basal cells dies, that means no epidermis is created in that area. And so you have kind of CT or connective tissue showing, which is a scar. We'll talk about lines of cleavage in a minute in terms of surgeons minimizing scar tissue. There are different names for this. Yeah. So there are different names for this. They're called dermatomes, tension lines, cleavage lines. These lines so your collagen and elastic fibers tend to organize themselves in a pattern. Most of it's kind of a parallel pattern. And so we've been able to map these patterns. I mean, we have individual differences, but for the most part, these lines of cleavage, or dermatomes, tend to kind of run parallel, right? So they run parallel to one another. And this is the way these collagen elastic fibers have a tendency to want to align themselves. And so surgeons understand where these dermatomes are. And so when they decide to do elective surgery, if you're having surgery done on your abdomen, they're going to make the incision along one of these lines of cleavage, because when you cut that direction, the skin naturally wants to go right back in that direction. And if you do it along the lines of cleavage and the skin goes right back, you have less scar tissue form, because that is where the skin just naturally goes. And so elective surgeries tend to have less scars because surgeons cut along a line of cleavage. If you get in an accident of some sort and you get a laceration that goes perpendicular to a line of cleavage, you're gonna have an issue with that wound going back together. And so the stitching is gonna be like this, and you're gonna have probably some kind of scar because the skin doesn't naturally wanna go back together that way. But that is some reason, like sometimes you may have noticed, like you'll cut your eyebrow right here. I should make that darker. So say you cut right there along the line of cleavage. So you have a cut there, but it immediately goes back together and you don't need to go get stitches. But if you were to cut in a direction that goes against the lines of cleavage, like say here would be the cut, you would probably have to have stitches because it's not going to want to go back together. Okay, so other dermal components, the cutaneous plexus is important to know. Where is that cutaneous plexus? That is in the papillary region. Well, I should say, let me back that up. The cutaneous plexus servicing the epidermis is in the papillary region. And this is the cutaneous plexus capillaries. These are, I shouldn't confuse you. Let's scratch that. You have a plexus coming up that are capillaries to the epidermis. The main cutaneous plexus, as per your diagram, is in the hypodermal subcutaneous region. The smaller blood vessels are in the subpapillary plexus, and that is in the papillary region. And that supplies epidermis. And so this blood flow is for thermal regulation and also for diffusion of nutrients, right? So diffusion of nutrients there. Something has to feed the skin. You have a lot of nerve endings that tell your, look, we have a lot of skin, and these nerve endings are telling your brain if something is good for you or bad for you, right? So you're going to have nice touch and you're going to have not so nice touch. And if it's not so nice, it tells your brain you need to move away from it, right? If you're getting burned because it's too hot and your skin's burning, that's a bad thing because your skin is your protective barrier. But we also have receptors that feel good, and so those are more the pressure ones. We can also feel vibrations, and we can feel different levels of touch. Subcutaneous layer, again, it's also referred to as hypodermal, so superficial fascia. It is not considered part of the integumentary, but it stabilizes the integumentary. It connects it to the underlying deep fascia. Mostly fat cells or adipose tissue. This is where your cutaneous plexus is. And that's where you get the name hypodermic needle or subcutaneous injections. You're going into that major blood vessels. So again, this goes through everything we talked about. Again, like I said, this changes over time with diet, so forth, right? So the COVID-19, and I mean that in 19 pounds, we're all sitting around on our computers and moving less. You're not walking to classes, or you're not moving as much. And so that can change your subcutaneous layer. Also, as you age, again, that subcutaneous layer gets thinner. That's why you tend to see blood vessels in older people right up against their skin. It doesn't mean that you're getting skinnier in terms of the amount of fat. It just means the fat is moving. So this is the diagram. You need to study this, fill this out. And this kind of gives you pretty pictures. One or two of you may have cut yourself and all the way down to the subcutaneous layer, and you can see these little balls of fat poke through. That's when you know you need to go in and get stitches. This is the dermis, so this is the reticular dermis, and this is the papillary dermis. And you can see there's more reticular fibers, so all these are reticular fibers. And so it is dominated, it's thicker. Epidermal ridges are what we call fingerprints. So epidermal ridges are fingerprints, and the way these epidermal ridges are arranged, they're in loops or whorls. I don't get into that in this class, but epidermal ridges create or make up your fingerprints. And this is genetically determined and is unique. This is showing you melanocytes down here in the stratum germinativum. They produce melanin. And the basal lamina, again, is the connection of the epidermis to the dermis, right? So this is the epidermis, and this is the dermis down here. And this is kind of showing you melanin pigments and melanocytes. So skin color determined by a number of things besides melanocytes, number of melanocytes. What's your blood supply? Is it, do you have a lot of blood going to your skin? You're going to be more red. If you have less blood supply to your skin, it can be blue. If your heart is not working, or you're having oxygen issues, your skin can look blue or cyanotic because you don't have enough oxygen bound to hemoglobin. Thickness of stratum corneum, super thick, it's going to look different than if it's thinner. People have different concentrations of keratin and melanin. That's genetically determined. So keratin, when you eat a lot of things with vitamin A, you can kind of have an orangey look to you. That's just because vitamin A is being kind of stored or congregated in this keratin. And so it doesn't, most people don't overeat carrots, so it's not usually a thing, but that can happen. We use vitamin A, by the way, for vision, photoreceptors in the eyes, but we also use vitamin A for other things. Melanocytes produce melanin, so this kind of goes through that. Melanocyte activity we've gone through, and this goes through repeat exposure to UV light, right? So we talked about epidermal skin cancer, premature wrinkling, abnormal connective tissue, long-term dermal damage, and then last, vitamin D. So this goes through vitamin D formation. Hair follicles and hair, we have hair everywhere. It's just some of those hairs are so small you do not see them, right? Hair consists of a papilla, a bulb, a matrix, which is the hair itself, the hair root, and the hair shaft. Hair, what you see is non-living, right? Because remember, the germ cells are down here. As newer cells are being created, older cells are getting pushed up. We call that growth, right? So your hair is growing. but that hair that is up here is too far away from the blood supply that's down here. And so when things are this far away from the blood supply, there's no nutrients or oxygen, and so you end up with dead cells. In this case, we call it hair. And that's why hair, you can have hair that is going to have remnants of things that were deposited here. And so hair can have, can keep substances or chemicals that used to be in your blood and can bind that inside your hair. So that's why checking hair, sometimes you can check different substances. Most hairs are going to have sebaceous glands attached to them and erector pili muscles attached to them. Hair grows on a 2 to 5 year cycle, after which that hair root will kind of shrivel up and fall out and a new one will replace it. People that are going bald, that hair root just doesn't get replaced. So that's why your hair is constantly falling out. There's always one hair root that's in that process of recycling in that 2 to 5 year cycle. So we always have hair that's falling out, but new hair growing back in. The pattern of which and whether it grows back or not is influenced by genetics, hormones, environmental factors. Stress can also affect hair roots growing back in. Hair color is determined by melanocytes. So your eye color, your skin color, and your hair color are all determined by the variation in numbers of melanocytes and how much melanin they produce. And your gray hair is just when your hair ceases to produce any melanin. So again, the hair growth cycle, you have an active phase and a resting phase. I don't ask you any specific questions on that, but sometimes you'll notice that there's a little like end of your hair that looks like a little ball. That is the club hair. And this is, again, hormonally regulated as well. So each follicle has a growth phase, and which is active, and then a resting phase. Glands. We have a number of glands. So sebaceous glands are going to lubricate and waterproof, right? So remember, water and oil don't mix. So if you have an oily layer on the top of your skin, water cannot go through it. It's also somewhat antibacterial. And so sebaceous glands are going to assist in lubricating the skin and waterproofing it. Sweat glands are what produce this watery secretion and can basically excrete things you don't want in your skin. Extra alcohol, extra sodium, this can all go out through your skin and also will cool you down or thermoregulate you. And so this is primarily controlled by the nervous system. It's for thermoregulation and excretion, some antibacterial properties, right? Now, you have two types of sweat glands. They're all exocrine. They all secrete things that go outside the body. But different types of sweat glands, you have apocrine sweat glands and merocrine sweat glands. And they just exocytose a different way, right? So merocrines are straight exocytosis of sweat and materials. Apocrine, part of the cell breaks off to release the sweat. But you also have cell debris. And so with that, it kind of smells. So these are your smelly sweat glands. And then the merocrine are just regular all over sweat glands. So apocrine tend to be in armpits, right? They're the smellier ones. Sometimes they produce a smell, we call it pheromones, but the axilla is your armpit, your groin, around your nipples. Every place else is just merocrine. Crenulous glands are producing earwax, they're in your ear, and mammillary glands produce milk, but only when lactating. So that's a special hormonally controlled secretion. Sebaceous glands secrete sebum, right? Holocrine, it's where the whole cell breaks open to release its content. There are different types of branched or alveolar, but I don't test on that. They're found all over the body except the palms and the soles of your feet, but they are in high concentrations, forehead, face, and upper back. And that sounds familiar in what is usually a pattern of acne, right? So the more sebaceous glands, if those ducts to the sebaceous glands become blocked, then you're going to have acne start to form, right? Because the oil backs up and grows bacteria. So again, merocrine glands, also sometimes referred to as eccrine glands. These are the exocytosis, regular sweat, and apocrine release, and they have parts of the cell membrane and so forth break off, so they have an odor, or we call them pheromones. So that's that. Mammillary glands, whole cell breaks open to release the milk, and crenulous glands produce earwax. Nails, I don't really get into nails too much. Couple of things just to note is the lunula. Lunula is like a moon, and it's this area here. And it's referred to as the lunula. The eponychium is here. We kind of call it a cuticle. And the hyponychium also. Hypo meaning below, ep meaning on top. And then you have the nail body. The nail root or germ cells are way back here. So if this is your cuticle, these germ cells that produce new nail are way, way, way deep. And so that's why you can lose this part of your nail, but it'll still grow back. It just takes time. Local control of the integumentary. So it does have some independence apart from your hormones and the nervous system. Calluses are usually due to mechanical stress. So if something rubs your epidermis over and over and over again, that stimulates epidermal cells or epidermal basal cells to increase production of new squamous cells. So that's where you get calluses. You just rubbing over and over and over again, and that just stimulates the basal cells to produce more epidermis in that area. It becomes bumpier or callousy. Skin usually regenerates after damage, unless you end up damaging, or if you damage the basal cells, then it will not produce new epidermis. So this is like, if you have a 3rd-degree burn, that means you damaged your basal cells. And so you have to have a skin graft. So you have to put new basal cells in that location to have something grow back. If you really damage those basal cells, it results in scar tissue or just connective tissue deposited there. And that's where you don't get new skin regenerating or new epidermis regenerating. Changes to hair and nails and skin can occur if you have some underlying disease. Pulmonary fibrosis shows up as clubbing. Clubbing is when, let's see how I can show you on this diagram right here. So people that don't have enough blood flow because their respiratory system isn't working, they have pulmonary fibrosis, this part of the nail starts growing up. And so the nail kind of has this weird bubbly appearance here. It's called clubbing. And so you can see changes, structural changes when, depending on the disease. Some people have different underlying disease. As you age, it's just depressing and sad, but nothing you can do about it. So what happens to you? Epidermis becomes thinner. Dermis becomes thinner. Your immune response, these Langerhans cells, decrease. What's the result? More infections. Less vitamin B production, and that can lead to osteoporosis. Melanocyte activities go down, more sunburns. Skin cancer risk. Glandular activity, sweat gland decreases. So say your sweat glands decrease. Can't regulate in heat. Right, so have a hard time thermoregulating. Also, the cutaneous plexus has a hard time thermoregulating, so it could be heat or cold. That's why older people have a hard time in extreme heat and extreme cold. Let's see, you go bald. That's always a good one. You get wrinkles. Blood spot Epidermis, so hard time regulating. And so it just sucks, right? So remember that robust diagram that we had? Isn't she cute? She's really cute. But if we go back, and I can go all the way back to that. Look how pretty that is. Isn't that pretty? Super pretty. Fast forward it, and she's cute, but what the heck happened? There's nothing left. Oh, so sad. Anyways, she wins because she's lived, it looks like a really long life, and she's cute and she's happy because she's smiling.